I appreciate you all being here. I know there's lots of things we could be doing, and it's heartening to see so many folks come out to learn about this issue and what we can do together to make sure we don't get saddled with another NAFTA-style trade agreement. Let me just start with the basics. So on June 26th, during the G20 meeting up in Canada, President Obama announced his intention to move forward with the Korea Free Trade Agreement starting in a big way this November. He instructed his cabinet, the U.S. Trade Representative and others, to push forward and make sure that it was ready to go and that all the final little tweaks were done by the G20 meeting that's happening in Seoul a week after our November elections. And so the first thing to know about the Korea FTA is that this is a free trade agreement that was negotiated by the Bush administration 3 years ago. It was, thank you, negotiated, signed by the Bush White House. You know, the Obama administration really had nothing to do with writing it. And so this is, again, a NAFTA-style trade agreement. It's not 100% identical to NAFTA, but the basic structure, huge parts of the text are exactly the same as NAFTA and CAFTA and the Peru FTA and many of the others. The second thing to know is that in terms of volume of trade, this is the biggest FTA since NAFTA itself. It's far bigger than CAFTA. It's far bigger than the Peru Free Trade Agreement. It actually dwarfs anything that President Bush was able to pass during his 8 years in office. And I think this is true. I haven't actually done the math, that it dwarfs everything that Bush was able to pass during his 8 years in office. But don't quote me on that one. So this, in other words, is a very, very big deal, literally and figuratively. If this moves forward, it's going to have a big impact on our economy. It has the potential to impact the environment. And our response to this proposal is going to determine the future of trade policy for at least the remainder of the Obama presidency and potentially much longer. I mean, I don't think anyone expects a president who's better on trade, you know, by 2017 at the earliest, and potentially even longer. So what we do in response to this is really going to have repercussions for quite a while. One of the first questions I often get asked when talking about the Korea FTA is why? Why is this happening? Why is President Obama moving forward with a Bush negotiated trade deal? More to the point, you know, why is he pushing forward with the biggest FTA since NAFTA in the midst of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression? I think there's a couple answers to that. Let me just start with, I don't know, I guess what I'd call the public answer, the public justifications that the White House and others give for wanting to see the Korea Free Trade Agreement pass. Folks might remember during the State of the Union address back in January, the President announced a plan to double U.S. exports within 5 years. A pretty ambitious plan. I think most Americans, frankly, would support that goal of doubling exports. It would certainly create new jobs, and that's something this country desperately needs. So the big line that we're being told about Korea, just like every other free trade agreement going back more than 15 years, is that, you know, this is going to increase our exports and thus increase jobs, okay? And, you know, and to be clear, I mean, I think in the year, if this is enacted, in the years that follow, exports to South Korea will increase, and there will be some jobs associated with those exports. But, you know, the thing that the free traders never say, which I'm sure all of you know, is that while exports may increase, imports are going to increase too. And if history is any guide, the imports are going to increase at a much, much faster rate than the exports. And just as exports are associated with job creation, imports for the most part are usually associated with job displacement. And that being the case, the overall balance of trade is what's the most important when you're looking about the economy. Yeah.
Well, this is exactly the same thing we heard from Nixon when he came to China.
It's been going on for a while. And, you know, and this is the thing that the free traders very rarely ever acknowledge. Even the U.S. International Trade Commission, which is the federal agency that, you know, that has routinely overstated the potential benefits of trade agreements over the years, even they admit, you know, in their predictions that the Korea FTA will increase the U.S. global trade deficit. The Economic Policy Institute, which is a more labor-friendly think tank and has a much stronger track record on predicting these things, they predict that this trade deal will double the U.S.-Korea trade deficit within just 7 years if it passes, and that imports from South Korea will be displacing 888,000 American jobs within those 7 years. Even if you factor in the job creation and other factors, we're talking about significant job loss in this country. In all likelihood, thousands of jobs lost here in Oregon. So when they say, the Korea Free Trade Agreement is going to increase exports, we say, well, so what? What's it going to do to the balance of trade? And they have no response to that. Interestingly, there's another angle on this whole exports question. Public Citizen's Global Trade Watch came out with a report just a couple weeks ago that actually suggests there's an export penalty associated with free trade agreements. By that I mean, not only is our balance of trade suffering under these free trade agreements, but that our exports alone are also potentially suffering under them. The study looked at 17 countries with which we have free trade agreements, and it found that exports did increase to those countries in the years that followed, but they didn't increase as quickly as exports to countries with which we don't have free trade agreements. So that's sort of an interesting angle on this thing. And I mean, even if you're, for whatever reason, just focused on exports, and you could care less about the balance of trade, even then free trade agreements, the record suggests, are a bad idea. So that sort of answers the major official justification for this. Let me just talk for a second about the political reason why they might be doing this. You look at public opinion polls, and poll after poll after poll shows that voters are dead set against free trade agreements. The Wall Street Journal just came out with a poll about a week ago that showed that 69% of Americans think free trade agreements are bad for the country, only 18% think they're good. It asked, what's the number one reason for the economic crisis and continued unemployment in this country? People said, number one, outsourcing. This is a reason why the Democrats now are doing a big Make It in America push during the election season. It's why, companies like Jeep are talking about how their cars are made in America in their ads all of a sudden. Voters hate offshoring. Voters hate free trade agreements. People know that. But there is a group that I think we all know free trade agreements are popular with, and that's Wall Street, K Street, the Chamber of Commerce, big business in general. And I'm speculating here, but my guess is that President Obama's political advisors have sort of made the political calculation that they want to show that they can deliver something on big business's agenda that a Republican president wasn't able to deliver on. I think the White House has sort of decided that if they push this trade agreement through shortly after the November election, far enough away from 2012 that it's not going to be a major media story, the base isn't really going to be complaining about it for too long, voters will forget about it by 2012, and then they'll be able to use that while they're doing their fundraising with corporate campaign donors for the re-election campaign. And if you think about it politically, I mean, it actually makes sense. Republicans, this is probably the one issue that Republicans are not going to attack the president on. Every other issue, I mean, they have. The corporate media, if the Republicans aren't complaining, they're not going to cover it. They're just stenographers. If no one in power is saying this is bad, and there's no conflict there, it's not going to be a major issue. It might get, an article in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, but it's not going to be sustained. Even if a majority of Democrats vote against it in Congress, they're probably not going to be doing the talk shows in 2012 calling out their own president on it. And so, there's really, only one group of people that could hold the president accountable for this, and that's, you and me, and our labor unions, and our environmental groups, and our faith organizations. If we're not out there making a stink about this, there's no one else who's going to do it. And in some ways, that's maybe a little bit scary. It's up to us. But in some ways, it's a little bit empowering, too. Because, and I'm going to get into this later tonight, there are signs already that the work that's being done is starting to make some cracks in the armor, that, the politicos in D.C. are reading these poll numbers and thinking, maybe people will remember this in 2012. How are we going to spin this in the next election? Oregon Fair Trade Campaign is working on a West Coast speakers tour with labor and farm allies from South Korea, which we're hoping to do in the next couple of months. The mobilization and the organizing against the FTA in South Korea has been massive. Tens of thousands of people in the street in repeated mobilizations again and again. A 10-day takeover of the Parliament building to prevent a vote. I mean, even, people lighting themselves on fire. People take this very, very seriously in South Korea. The opposition has been inspiring, heroic, and so we're going to let you hear from the people who are actually doing that work directly before too long. But I did just want people to know that what we're doing here today is very, very much in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in South Korea.